You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Katharine Weber.
Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are links in the right-hand sidebar where you can subscribe to the show on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. hankgarner.com, where you can listen on the site or subscribe everywhere. Today's show is brought to you by Grammarly, an intelligent writing app. Download Grammarly's browser extension and create a free Grammarly account at www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. That's www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. Grammarly is an excellent tool that will help you get your document that you're working on in shape before sending it off to your editor for that final pass. If you need that first look, Grammarly is the place to go. Also, for all of your correspondence on the web, Grammarly can help you make sure that you're saying what you intend to say. GetGrammarly.com/Hank. Also, thanks to my buddy C. Stephen Manley for sponsoring the show. His book, Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1, is one of my favorite urban fantasy books that have come out this year. Chuck has been on the show before. He's one of the hosts of Keystroke Medium, one of my favorite group of guys, and one of my favorite podcasts out there. Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1. Clint Mercer is about to get a crash course in magic. I love this book. I know you will too. Pick up Master of Hounds today. There's a link to it in the show notes. We'll talk more about it as the month goes on. Now on to our author interview for today. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining us again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Katharine Weber on Skype with me. She is dialing in all the way from Ireland, and I think so far she sounds pretty amazing. So I think you guys are in for a real treat with Katharine today. Katharine has a brand new book that is out now when you're hearing this. Still Life with Monkey is the title, and if it's anything like Katharine's other books, we are in for a great treat. Thank you for joining me today, Katharine.
I'm delighted to be here.
Katharine, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, I have a very specific, very clear memory of sitting at a very old Underwood typewriter, the kind that had the silver circles on the keys.
Oh, yes.
And desperately trying to type a story, although I think I was 4 and was not proficient at writing, spelling, or typing. And I think my mother helped me just a little bit, but it was actually a story about an old woman who ate furniture, and she ate a chair and a table, and then she died.
Well, naturally, I mean, where do you go after you've, eaten a couch? Katharine, whose Underwood typewriter was that?
That I had something to say that had not been said before, a story to tell.
Wow. Whose Underwood typewriter was that?
It was my mother's, I'm sure of that. And in fact, only after her death did I discover a file of short stories she had written that were never published, and not for lack of trying. And I had no knowledge that she had even attempted to write fiction. She never said a word to me about it when I started publishing my own novels, but it was definitely typed on that same typewriter.
Wow. Was storytelling discussed in your home?
Well, I don't know if it was discussed per se, but stories were certainly told. I grew up in a house full of crazy people with a lot of books and a lot of stories, and counter stories. So I think from a very early age, I had a very strong awareness of family stories, family narrative, the public story, the private story, the hidden stories, the secret stories. I roamed around the house and found letters in the attic that gave me insights into all kinds of things that were secrets, like marriages my parents had had that I didn't know about, things like that. So it was an overwhelming amount of story, I think, that I grew up surrounded by, and not all of them benign.
Right.
A lot to try to figure out, a lot of mystery. I think I grew up with a sense that for every story there was a counter story or two or three. Partly because of being surrounded by people who didn't tell the truth, or who shaded the truth. My last book is a family memoir where one of the organizing spines is my father's 800 pages that I was able to pry loose anyway, FBI records. So the way the FBI told the story of my father, which was incomplete and inaccurate and redacted, was certainly another way of telling the story of that I had spent my whole life trying to understand.
Oh my goodness, that sounds a lot like my family. Not the FBI record, but the although.
Well, you don't know. There could be an FBI record.
Well, that's what I was about to say. There probably is. There's some grand characters in my family. But the idea of stories and counter stories and the stories that we tell to shade our narrative and to put ourselves or our family in a better light, and that's. Truth is stranger than fiction a lot of times.
There's also the way that people tell a story to themselves as they're hearing a story. So it's the way we hear stories as much as the way we tell them that interests me very much, because I think we add meaning and we make things up about what we think we know and what we think is happening. Right. And that's yet another kind of a story, counter story.
Well, after that story of the woman that ate furniture, where did you go from there?
Well, my father, who was a crazy pack rat, brought home a case of adding machine tapes, those rolls of white paper. We did not have an adding machine, but it had been a bargain, I'm sure. And I started inserting those into the typewriter, rolling it into the platen, and typing newspaper columns, literally typing stories in columns, which I would then cut up and glue down on large sheets of paper to make a newspaper. This was very difficult because these rolls of tape, of adding machine tape, were actually not cut correctly. They sort of ran off at an angle, which is probably why they were, either free or very cheap. So I was constantly dealing with a drifting margin. But I was assembling a newspaper with all the news that I could manage to type on there. So I was physically creating a newspaper with these I think these strips of paper looked like newspaper columns to me.
Wow. So this was just a constant part of your life and an obsession maybe that you were going to tell stories, you were going to craft books or any other thing that people would read. That was just part of your makeup from as early as you can remember?
I do think so, but I did come from a family that loved words. Both my parents were very strange people, not happy with each other, but they shared a love of books. They were deeply well-read. There were no books off limits to me, and I simply grew up in a household where it was expected that you would, be, reading books incessantly, books of all kinds, books, from every shelf. Nothing was off limits, which is why I probably didn't quite grasp everything I was reading in later Chatterley's Lover, but I was certainly reading it when I was, 11. So the idea that important things were happening in the covers, inside the covers of those books, was certainly a message that I got. My parents, their points of reference in the world and in culture were several, but one of them was certainly, the world that was inside books.
That makes me wonder. We have this constant conversation on this show about whether storytelling is something that you're born with, or it's something you acquire. And, and we may, in a case like yours, we may never know. Is it nature or is it nurture? Is it that you were a born storyteller, or was it that you were raised around books and kind of expected to absorb books? Do you have an opinion about that?
Oh, I think it's all nature and nurture. I think there are people born with perfect pitch, but I also think you can develop relative pitch. So that's nature, nurture. I grew up in a family of very accomplished eccentrics. So I also think that I did absorb a sense of freedom to invent, freedom to, make footprints in the snow that hadn't been made by anybody else. And my grandmother was a very accomplished composer of Broadway show tunes. And, my mother's father's family were, well-known in a variety of fields for a variety of reasons. And I'm not saying that to be, name-dropping impressive things so much as to say that I think I grew up in a family that had maybe a certain kind of arrogance to believe that we have something new to contribute. We can make stuff up. We can invent things. We can come up with systems, and the world, is going to be interested in them. For instance, my great-grandfather invented the Federal Reserve System. Speaking of complicated systems that are controversial, so I think I grew up knowing that. Not that the world was my oyster. I don't think I was particularly confident that the world was my oyster, but that stories were something we all are entitled. We are all entitled to our own stories, our own versions of things, even if they fly in the face of sort of the standard accepted reality that other people believe in other houses. I think I also did know that my family really had many very difficult, strange people in it, which can set you apart. It can make you feel like the one of these is not like the others in a number of ways. But isn't that where writers come from?
Yeah. And more than just your family, there's a bit of arrogance that goes along with writing and publishing in general. The idea that you, out of 7 billion people on the planet, have something to say, and that you would like other people to read the things that you have to say. And
that you expect other people to be interested in them and to be entertained and moved by them. Yeah. Exactly.
And so it's a weird kind of thing that we talk about arrogance in a lot of parts of life, but then when we talk about art, that sort of arrogance kind of gets a pass,
It's not just arrogance. It is arrogance, but it's not only arrogance. Exactly. I think arrogance is necessary, but not sufficient. Because I also think there's almost like the problem for the novelist for Take Your Child to Work Day is every day is Take Your Child to Work Day. You have to be able to tune in to the things that accountants are trained to tune out, which is to be reactive to things, to see patterns that other people might just filter out because they're too busy being efficient, to hear things and see echoes, to see and hear metaphors all around. A lot of that, and they probably call you psychotic, but some of that is a child's way of reacting to the world. And I think that to write fiction, you have to still be able to tune in to that sense of the world, which in ordinary life, most people just really let a lot pass them by. They can't see it. They don't see it. They're getting their work done, and their work isn't writing fiction.
Right. Katharine, what was your first? Who was the first person that recognized your storytelling gift that was not in your family?
Oh, probably I would say teachers. I had a wonderful fourth grade teacher who certainly recognized that I was a very fast reader, and she would challenge me with more and more things to read at higher and higher levels. But she also praised my writing. And then there was a teacher in 7th grade, the late, great Harry Edson at Kew Forest School, a school where I did not graduate. I left there, as did Donald Trump, a decade ahead of me. And interestingly, the Kew Forest School does not have him on their website in any way. President in the White House of the school doesn't want to mention it. But there was a wonderful English teacher there named Harry Edson, and he would often chat to me after class at the end of the school day, and he would mention books and characters as if he expected me to know who they were. And I would run out and, read that book so I would know who they were. And I would have read that story. And it occurs to me now that he may have known that he was doing that. He may well have been dropping those breadcrumbs for me by making, confident references to characters in literature so that I would go out and read those things and keep up. But I felt very seen and very recognized, and I think that's an incredibly valuable gift to a child, to an adolescent, to be that teacher. And as someone who teaches now, I do my best to see and recognize young students who deserve recognition. All students deserve recognition, but the gifted writers who really can just do with a little more wind in their sails.
Right.
It's a kind of pay it forward.
Yeah. And it's really such a small thing that when you recognize someone and see that gift, to just give a little encouragement. I've had so many guests on the show that refer back to, a time and a place where someone, maybe it was a teacher or a parent or someone that just recognized something, gave them just a little piece of encouragement. And they held on to that tightly for 20, 30 years sometimes when that first book came out and they saw the fruition of that encouragement finally. And in a lot of cases, I think that adult probably didn't even remember the encounter, but the recipient sure did.
Yes, or maybe they did. I mean, Annie Dillard, I think, said to dozens of people, hundreds of people perhaps. She said it to me, and I wasn't one of her students. I was a friend. But I know she said it to students. Alex Chee told me she said it to him, which was not only did she use the words, "you have what it takes," which is, what a wonderful thing to tell a young writer starting out. She said, go into a bookstore. Every time you're in a bookstore, go over to the fiction shelf and find where your books would be on the shelf alphabetically and put your finger there and mark that spot, and one day your books will be in that spot.
That's great. That is fantastic. Katharine, what was the first book that you wrote that you knew would be published?
The first book that was published, Objects in Mirror Are Closer Than They Appear, was truly my first novel, and it had an unusual history, which is to say that a piece of it, when I was writing it, and had never published a word of fiction at all, although I was writing book reviews and literary profiles, and I had a newspaper column in the New Haven Register for 2 years. So I was publishing. I had a byline, but I had never published fiction, and I was working on this novel, and I put together a piece of it as a freestanding story, and it was published in the New Yorker, and that was my first fiction in print. And it was, a novel that was 3/4 unwritten at that point. But that certainly did help me feel that I had a novel to finish. And the world is not waiting for anybody's first novel, generally. But if a piece of it has appeared in the New Yorker, the world actually is a little bit interested to know, what is this and who is this and where's this novel? So that was really helpful, that publication.
Well, that's also an interesting story because a lot of times we talk about that first novel and the absence of pressure on that novel. that is different from a second or third novel, because usually no one knows you're writing that novel. So you have all the time in the world.
No one knows and no one cares.
Exactly.
The world is not waiting for your first novel. It only matters to you, pretty much.
Exactly. And while no one is waiting for it, there's also no pressure on it. It exists solely in your mind and in the minds of the one or two people you might have told about it. And then you get the opportunity to edit and sometimes to death, but to get it just the way you want it before it comes out. Well, you didn't have that experience if it was partially published in the New Yorker. And you don't have the experience of the other way, but do you feel like that your experience, that having that partial publication, was that a help to you to motivate you?
It was a tremendous help, and in a practical sense, being edited by Dan Menaker at the New Yorker, found me in the slush pile, and then being copy edited by the copy editing fairies. I don't know who they were, but I saw their writing all over those galleys. It was still very much of a handwritten deal in some ways. And seeing my words set in New Yorker type in galleys and then with all kinds of writing all over them. The experience of the copy editing, what I learned from being edited so rigorously and so intelligently, I could take in and have that as almost a voice in my head. The issues that applied to that story, Friend of the Family, applied to the entire novel. And the thinking and the way of thinking about language, the way of thinking about my sentences, characters, choices I was making, it was just an incredible turbo lesson in writing and revising that made a huge difference to me. It was extraordinary. I am perpetually, forever grateful to Dan Menaker for that experience and that opportunity. And I honestly don't know whether my first novel would have been published without not just the imprimatur of being published in the New Yorker, but the quality of the editing and the way I could teach myself to revise and write and revise and write after that experience of being edited there. It made all the difference to me, I think.
Well, that brings up a great topic. And it goes back a little bit to that writer's arrogance that we talked about earlier. And we know it's not pure arrogance, but that's a great term that we'll just use for the show. In that we believe that our words deserve to be read. And a lot of writers bristle at the idea of being edited because they think, well, these are the words I wrote. I intended to say this way. If you edit it, it's going to change what I said, and that's not what I said. But as you discovered and you gush on about this experience that you had and how it made you a better writer, talk a little bit about, if you will, about the role of editing in making you better say what you're trying to say instead of changing what you say. Kind of address that fear that some writers have that an editor is going to change what they say.
No, I think that's a very insecure and limited approach to feel that you said it the best, most perfect way and everything after that is a compromise. I think that's not mature. And I'm not talking about pandering to the market or writing, accommodating an editor because of the market or the commercial needs of a publisher. I'm really talking about simply making it the best possible writing you can make it. And if you resist good editing, then you are not the writer you could be, is all I can say, because a good editor doesn't have the answers. A good editor has the questions. A good editor has all the right questions and maybe some suggestions for solutions, and maybe those suggestions aren't what you will choose to do, but they will point you in the right direction because the editor can identify an area that needs work or revising or sort of thickening. There are places where you can make a better choice, a less obvious choice. There are places where you just are not conscious of your own language. I think we all have, no matter how inventive and highly literate and imaginative we may be, we all have our own tics, our own cliches. So even if it's an outlandish phrase that ordinary people never use. If it's your cliche, then you need to think about how many times it should appear in a chapter or in an entire novel. And you don't always have the best ear for your own language. But I think a good editor tunes in, can point out those things to you. And the better the editing, the better a writer you can teach yourself to be. And I think a great editor doesn't just edit that manuscript. A great editor really contributes to your education and your development as a writer going forward. I mean, I was edited, 4 books of mine, 7, were edited by John Clausen, who was at FSG for my first books with him, and then at Crown and Harmony and Shea Earhart Books, at Random House, and then he went to Norton, where I have not followed him, not yet anyway. But he is a marvelous editor, and I feel that having been edited by John Clausen is an education each time. And I felt that he, talk about someone who sees you and knows you and gets you and knows what you're doing. It's a tremendous piece of teamwork. And so for a writer to feel above that or beyond it or, not in need of it or, I've already written that sentence exactly the way I meant it to be and that's that. Well, good luck with that. I mean, maybe you're the most brilliant writer ever and you don't need editing. But maybe no one's ever going to read that novel to find out whether or not they agree with you if you're that brittle and unable to consider more possibilities for your writing. What makes you think you're done? I mean, I think that, it's very hard to be done. It's very, very hard to be done. It shouldn't be that easy to be done.
Yeah. Most of the time, I think someone has to pry it out of your hands and say, okay, this is going to publish because you're just going to keep working it to death if you don't, eventually come to peace with it. And it's very hard to be done with it, for sure.
I think it's Balzac, but it could, for all I know, it's Mark Twain. Somebody brilliant and quotable said, a great work of literature is never finished, only abandoned.
Yeah, I like that. So, Katharine, that book went on to be a New York Times notable book of the year, and then a Publishers Weekly Best Book of the Year. How do you follow up a debut success like that?
Well, I do think the second novel is challenging. If you think that the first one, you had your whole lifetime, packed into writing it in a certain way. And then the second one, a year later, 2 years later, at most 3 years later, you simply haven't put as much time in. You haven't dwelled with it as long. It doesn't have sort of everything and then some the way a first novel usually does. So I think it can be a dilemma. I started and stopped after just a few pages, the second novel that wasn't going to go anywhere. And then I wrote my second novel, The Music Lesson, which is my shortest book, very, very different story. It's really a novella by many standards. Which is to say, one short, tight narrative arc without the same kind of, multiplicity of stories and characters and backstories and side stories and secondary plots. It's one straight shot, and it's a very, very different kind of novel. And by many measures, it's my most successful novel, depending on how you measure such things. It was certainly translated into more than a dozen languages and continues to exist out there in the world. It's had a couple of different paperback editions. Book groups still talk about it. The French edition is the one that seems to be the one paying the most royalties these days. But I somehow sidestepped the deadly, inadequate, inert, less than second novel. I think it's like a stillborn child. I mean, I think I know what that novel was going to be, and it never developed, and it just didn't happen. But I think it's a challenge. I think the second novel is such a challenge that there are these horrible statistics that now more than half the authors who publish a first novel will never publish another novel. That doesn't mean they won't write one. It means they won't publish one.
Oh, what a brutal statistic.
Yes. It's actually something probably that nobody should hear who's trying to write a first novel. Or even worse, trying to write a second novel. Yeah.
So after that book, Objects in Mirror Are Closer Than They Appear, you wrote 5 other books before your new one, Still Life with Monkey. Tell us about the new book. What an intriguing title. And what brought this book to you?
Well, first of all, I do think titles are really, really important, and I could spend a lot of time talking about titles. I love the title Still Life with Monkey because it's just right. It's like discovering what you want to name your baby, and it's just the right name, you know. And it's about an architect who has been in an accident, which he caused, and it has killed his protege and assistant, and it has left him a quadriplegic who now is going to be living in a very different way than what he thought he had in his life. He's in his late 30s. He's very successful. He and his wife have been trying to have a baby, and now suddenly he is just reduced in so many ways that he can barely tolerate. And he's very depressed and just isn't sure he wants to live this life at all. And his wife, Laura, who is an art conservator, which is to say she's someone who fixes broken things, tries to do what she can to fix him, and comes up with bringing in a helper monkey. Helper monkeys are a real thing. Helping Hands is the organization outside of Boston that has been placing trained capuchin monkeys with people who are living in wheelchairs, living with wheelchairs, people who use wheelchairs, I should say properly, for over 30 years. And it's a very small organization. They train these capuchin monkeys over a period of years to learn 50, 60 commands. And helper monkeys change lives. So, knowing about helper monkeys, learning about helper monkeys led me to consider the fictional possibilities, which led me to this story of an architect who becomes a quadriplegic, and a helper monkey comes into his life, into his marriage, virtually, and becomes the third character in the family of this couple. He also is a twin, so his twin brother is in the story. So it's really about how you can figure out how you want to live your life, and when things change very abruptly, when your life is not at all what you thought it was, or what you expected it to be, and what is enough, and who has the right to make decisions about another person, about what is tolerable and what is not tolerable. So, without going too far into the plot and spoiling the plot in any way, I want to say that it's also a novel that takes up the conversation about the right to die, and who gets to make those choices. And I do think, although it is certainly a novel with ideas in it, I don't mean it to be a novel of ideas, but I do think I'm asking readers to consider whether someone who is differently abled therefore has fewer options to make all kinds of choices about life, including whether to keep living that life. And differently abled people don't necessarily have the same options for all kinds of practical reasons to make choices about whether or not they want to keep living. A helper monkey offers anyone who is living with limited mobility options of privacy and independence and autonomy. And what is privacy and independence and autonomy? And, those are questions. in the novel as well. I'd like to say the novel it is also funny. It's not a grim story. I know that sounds grim. It's not at all. Still life with monkey, in other words, is about someone who is living a still life. He's paralyzed. He's also still living his life. It's still life. And now here comes the monkey, whose name is Ottilie.
I love it.
So the monkey is very much a character in the story.
Right. Some authors talk about how the story shapes for them. Some people say that they get an idea for a plot, and then characters kind of form around that plot, and then the book kind of takes off. Some people have a character that comes to them, and the character is just so intriguing that we start watching the character, and all of a sudden we're dictating what's happening in the character's life. And then sometimes it's a setting, and then out of this setting, the people that inhabit the setting come about, and the book takes off. How does that usually happen for you, or is there kind of a rhyme or reason how stories form for you?
I think they all form in a very similar way, although each of my novels is very, very different, which is a combination. First of all, I agree with everything you've said, and I often begin a writing workshop talking about understanding stories come from, and how the best thing a writer can do is try to understand, for him or herself, just what works for you, what is your process. And for me, it's situation. So that's not exactly plot; it's situation. So if this thing is happening or has happened, and there are these people, and this is what's been going on, and situation might come to me from a story I've heard, or something I've read in the news, or heard about, or thought about, or read in a novel that sparked an idea for something that wasn't at all in that novel. But out of situation grows the character, or the characters, in the sense of, well, who would be in that situation? Who would those people be? And if they were in that situation, what would they do? And what would they do? What would they want? What would they do to get what they want? And then what? And then what? And so it's a way of growing the events of the story and the characters sort of in tandem, because what would they do? How would they do it? What would they want? Why would they want that? A novelist, like a detective, wants to understand motive. If you understand motive, you understand the novel you're writing, you understand the crime you're solving. It's about motive. And so out of situation comes the question. It's almost like the back formation of what was the motive that got people into this situation, or maybe it was an act of God, but now what do they do about it? Situations are either caused by someone or something, or a confluence of events or someone's or some things. So out of situation grows event and character, and the character propels the story, and the story drives the character, and that's how you move down the road. For me, I think I could reduce it to that one word each time: situation.
Katharine, how do you keep a book like Still Life with Monkey that could be very grim, and certainly some of the circumstances are grim, but the book is not grim? How do you balance those hard things, these very raw emotions that obviously come with the characters and the situations that they're dealing with? How do you balance a little comic relief without being comedic? Does that make sense at all? Like how do you bring levity without being silly?
Well, I suppose it's for others to decide whether or not it's silly. I think that having a great sense of humor is what has gotten a lot of people through a lot of really tough times. And I also think that almost anything has its humor. It really does. It can be a very dark, black humor, but it has its humor. And, tragedy plus time equals comedy. And when it's happening, you don't necessarily think it's a tragedy. I mean, sometimes you're just getting through events, and it's only in retrospect that someone else might label it a tragedy. But I think that it's the flip side of the coin. I think it's inevitable that if you have a sense of humor, then almost anything is going to strike you as funny, even in some of the darkest times. At certain moments, I don't mean to be cavalier. There's nothing funny about quadriplegia, but I know a couple of people who have been quadriplegics for years, and both of them have superb senses of humor, and they can also make jokes about their own situation, their own circumstances. I also think that probably just as situation is the one-word answer for, where do my novels come from? What's the grain of sand that grows the pearl? I also do think that every one of my novels takes up some pretty serious moral issues of moral compass, although it's very often when people do the right things for the wrong reasons, for the wrong things for the right reasons, that it gets interesting. I do think there is a morality in some way in the center of most of my stories, but I also think there is humor. I think there's always a great deal of humor. And, if to know me is to know that I'm capable of saying things in situations that maybe no one else would dare say. I appreciate your sense of the novel, which is to say, I think you're saying that it has humor without being silly and without being vulgar or sort of off base. But I think it's human. I think it's where people find intimacy and solace. I think the humor that exists one of the things in my novel is that it really is the portrait of a marriage of long duration. And I think inside a marriage, there is a secret language, private language, that affection. There's a marvelous line in the Jan Struther novel, Mrs. Miniver, about looking across the table at a dinner party and there always being an eye to catch. I think that the humor of intimate relationships, of partnerships, of whatever kind of marriage or partnership, close connection we have with other human beings, which is also parent and child or a sibling, or deep friendships. I think that those connections inevitably have their own private sort of system of humor also. That's a very big part of living our lives every day.
Well, the other thing that humor does, and you alluded to this, is that your books, you said, almost always have a strong undertone of a moral compass. There's something you feel very passionately about that you're getting across in the story, and there's that can be overdone to the point of heavy-handedness. That we've all read those books where it's just preachy, and you're just like, oh my gosh, and a little bit of humor is able to kind of diffuse some of that, and there's you can get some very strong points across when you have someone smiling and laughing, and it doesn't seem to be as heavy-handed. Do you find that to be true?
Well, sure. I mean, my fourth novel, Triangle, has at its heart the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911. And that's not a funny topic. And at the same time, I think there's humor through the book. There are oral histories with the last living survivor of the fire, my fictional character. And she's very grumpy and short-tempered, with a sort of heavy-handed, clueless, ultra-feminist, agendaed interviewer. There is comic relief. I think comic relief is important. And it's, again, in the olden days, they used to say, a play doctor would say of a turgid play, if you want to send a message, call Western Union. And I suppose kids these days don't even know what that is. But I think moral dilemmas are interesting. So I don't think it's about some sort of standard for morality or anything like that, but I think characters struggling with moral dilemmas that have been thrust upon them, and making choices, and recognizing that, that what's at stake, and what's at stake is always central to a good novel, and what's at stake for the characters can shift in the course of the novel. And loyalties shift, and plans change. What does a character want, and then what does a character want after that, and then what happens? All of those things. I do think the issues of making moral choices, or making choices and trying to decide for yourself what you can live with. How can you live with yourself? If there's no humor in that same life, I don't know. It's not a novel I want to read. And above all, I write novels that are novels I would want to read. I mean, that's my standard. And I guess I think there's humor in almost anything. You approach it from the right direction.
For sure. Katharine, I can't wait to watch how the book is received. It's out everywhere now. We've got links to it in the show notes of this episode. If people are just discovering you and your work, where can they find you online to maybe dig into your back catalog and to follow what's coming up next for you?
Well, I appreciate that question. KatharineWeber.com has news about my various appearances. I'm at a lot of book festivals this fall, this season. And I also link to other things I do, whether it's essays. I'm doing a little bit of guest blogging. I'm an editor-at-large for Kenyon Review, and I do podcast conversations with authors there. Perhaps that's a familiar-sounding activity to you. Very, very occasionally, which is to say, the two that I've got linked at KatharineWeber.com from the Kenyon Review site are Margot Livesey, the marvelous Margot Livesey, and Ruth Ozeki. And I will be doing a couple more this fall. I teach at Kenyon College, and one of my activities there, one of my mandates as the Thomas Chair in Creative Writing, is bringing writers to campus. So I'm thrilled to say that my former Yale student from years ago, when I taught fiction writing at Yale for 8 years. She was then called Reese. She's now R.O. Kwon, Kwon, The Incendiaries. Her first novel is just out. I think she's going to win major prizes, and she's making her mark now. She's getting fantastic reviews everywhere with The Incendiaries, and I'm thrilled that I have her book come to Kenyon College in November, and we will do a podcast conversation. But it's also thrilling, I have to say, when a former student makes good, and this is as good as it gets. She's really, I'm really proud. It took her a lot of time. I think she was Yale class of 02 or 03, but here she is with her novel. So I'm on Twitter, usually 3/4 political, 1/4 literary these days, and then the occasional cat picture. But I'm teaching, and I'm working on a new novel. So what can I say? I hope people discover Still Life with Monkey. I hope it makes them want to go back and read my other novels. Each one is very much its own story, but there are linking features and characters who float from one to the next. There's always something, sort of Easter eggs for my readers, where there's something to recognize from other novels in every subsequent novel. So it's all existing in the same fictional universe in that sense. And a lot in New Haven, Connecticut, a city of endless texture and nuance and grit. A very, very interesting place to set fiction. So there's that sort of reality, that my novels tend to share from one to the next of setting and sense of place. So.
I love that so much, Katharine. We're going to send to everyone to pick up their copy of Still Life with Monkey. Katharine, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
No, I've loved this conversation. I hope it's of interest to readers as well as writers. I love hearing about other writers' process and thoughts. So I hope this just becomes part of the ongoing conversation that you so marvelously keep in the flow.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
You took a terrible risk tonight.
Why?
You don't know? The first rule.
I was told by a friend that I shouldn't reveal my gift to anyone who doesn't have a gift themselves.
That's exactly right.
Because everyone we tell dies.
Yes, you might have marked me for death.
Made you a target for a ghost. Why can't people know what we can do? What makes it so dangerous? Valerie took up the fireplace prongs and stabbed the logs.
It's called the Great Curse.
Sparks exploded from glowing crevices and drizzled upwards, ricocheting off the black belly of the cauldron, turning into tiny ashes that disappeared up the chimney.
It was cast by a powerful witch over 300 years ago.
Witch? Sorry, but witch? Please, there's no such thing. Valerie closed her eyes. A spoon leapt from Jason's dish and caught him in the temple. He wiped melted ice cream from his cheek. You were saying?
She cast the curse to stop the witch trials.
In Salem? Jason searched his memory.
1692. They burned her alive in the Salem Common. The only witch to be burned.
The cauldron smoked slightly. Its contents had evaporated. A sharp, charred scent filled the room. Wait, said Jason. There were no witches. They were just, victims of religious hysteria, right? So you're saying the witch trials were justified?
Justified? So if a witch did exist, it would be okay to kill her?
No, I just thought... You're right. Never mind.
There was one witch in Salem, at least. A woman with a powerful gift. She only wanted to protect people like us, to give the gifted their anonymity, refuge. She cast the Great Curse as she burned. She proclaimed that mortals who know a witch shall know death. And that is the Great Curse. And it's still in effect after all this time.
Mortal, as in...
Non-gifted. No mortal can know about you, about any authentic witch.
Jason winced. Isn't there another word besides that? She shrugged. So no one can know what I am, what I can do, or else they become a target.
Right. The spirit world will obey the Great Curse and try to kill them.
The spirit world.
The other realm.
Jason rubbed his eyes. How much of this was reality and how much of this was Valerie's nutty brand of mysticism? He felt himself pulling back, as usual, for fear of contagion. He'd spent his whole life reading science fiction. He hated paranormal tales. This was not his genre.